Hi, listener. This is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ego and ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. All right, so today I'm actually quite excited about the book I'm doing a reading from because this is a book about quantum physics, but it's different from mainstream quantum physics. So it's and also so it's done in a way that doesn't have like maths in it or stuff. It's for people who aren't like physicists to read. It's for the layman. It's Quantum Theory and Free Will by Henry P. Stapp. How mental intentions translate into bodily actions. Published by Springer, it seems to be. Springer International Publishing. Oh, this Springer imprint is published by Springer Nature. It seems to be published at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, University of California, Berkeley, CA, USA. So I'm going to get on with it. But it's honestly, I haven't read this yet at all, but actually I've briefly looked at it. Yeah, it's about quantum physics, but I know this guy's a pantheist of some kind and critical of materialism, despite being solidly in a quantum physics perspective and not diverging from physics, which is basically scientific evidence for mysticism. I'm not sure, I'm not, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, but that's my perspective of it. I just guess we're going to find out. It's not actually that long, this book. It's only like, how many pages? Like 141 pages or something, 140 pages. So yeah, all right, straight to the prologue. A revolution in our scientific understanding of the physical world occurred during the 20th century. That upheaval revised our idea of science itself and thrust our conscious thoughts into the dynamical process that determines our physical future. During the preceding 2 centuries, from the time of Isaac Newton, our conscious experiences had been believed by most scientists to be passive witnesses of a clock-like physical universe consisting primarily of tiny atomic particles and light that evolves with total disregard of our mental aspects. Our conscious thoughts had, for 200 years, been exiled from science's understanding of the workings of nature. But during the first quarter of the 20th century, that earlier classical theory was found by scientists to be unable to account for either the observed properties of light or the plethora of empirical data pertaining to the dynamical properties of actual atoms such as hydrogen and helium. A better theory was needed. In 1925, Werner Heisenberg, the principal creator of quantum mechanics, concluded from an analysis of the data of atomic physics that the basic precepts of prevailing classical theory were profoundly wrong, and that the root of the difficulties lay in Newton's ascribing to his conception of atoms certain properties that empirically observed atoms do not possess. The first of these purely fictional ideas is that an atom has, at each instant of time, a tiny, well-defined location in 3D space. The second is that the evolving physical properties are completely determined by prior physical properties alone, with no input from our conscious thoughts. These latter mental realities were assumed in classical theory to be completely determined by the physically described properties of the associated brains and nervous systems. Hence, they do not, in that theory, constitute extra free variables. But in quantum mechanics, the evolution of the physically described aspects is not fully determined by physically described properties alone. Our conscious experiences enter irreducibly into the dynamics. Now, allow me to have a look at that again, just to properly take it in. So the physical location being in a defined place, that was proven wrong by quantum physics. And the idea that conscious thoughts had no impact on how the fundamentals of physics works, that was also proven false. Although it's interesting that despite this, physicalism has remained the prevailing doctrine. I'm sure I'll have more to say about that later. And I'm sure Stapp will too. The basic principle that guided Heisenberg to the successful new theory was that it should be based on properties that we can choose to measure. These choices on the part of conscious agents are free choices from amongst the many possibilities allowed by the theory, of which measurement to actually perform. Here, the adjective free means that the choices are not determined by purely physical laws alone. They are determined in part by irreducible mental aspects of psychophysical observers. The observer's free choices are thus non-physical inputs into the physical dynamics. Our minds are not mere side effects of material physical properties. Our minds matter. Now again, I'm going to go back. So according to in regard to the theory and the testing of quantum mechanics, the variables, I could say, the choices that matter, the mental aspect that matters is a choice of which measurement to perform. Now, I'm not sure, but I think it's whether you're performing a measurement on the location or whether you're doing it on the movement of the particle. And certainly this also relating to the superposition of different possibilities, which collapses when the observation happens. An observation is scientific observation, that is, depends on which choice, the choice of which observation to make, what to measure, the movement or the location, right? And Schrodinger's cat is basically derived from that. It's more complex than that, of course, but yeah. So yes, our minds matter, and the mental element of free choices is fundamentally affecting physical processes. Heisenberg's study of the data of atomic physics convinced him that the empirical data of atomic physics cannot be reconciled with the naive realism of classical mechanics, which considers a person's perception of external physical property to be a mere causally inert byproduct of the observational process of creating a brain-body representation of that property. I should probably read this slower generally because I read it and I'm like, wait, what did I just read there? Okay. So naive realism considers that a person's perception of external physical property is causally inert byproduct of the observational process, creating a brain-body representation of that property. According to the classical scenario, nature goes to great length to creating a seemingly new kind of stuff, mental reality, which has no physical function or effect. The idea being that at most, according to the classical narrative, let's say, at most, mental activity or dynamics are emergent properties from the interaction of chemicals and electronic signals. That's the emergentism principle, which is one theory when it comes to free will and consciousness. However, it does depend on the idea that the mental elements don't really have a role in the physical going-ons, but rather that the mental events are entirely determined by physical events. Anyway, carrying on. Quantum mechanics, on the other hand, assigns to mental reality a function not performed by the physical properties, namely the property of providing an avenue for our human values to enter into the evolution of psychophysical reality, and hence make our lives meaningful. Quantum mechanics accounts with fantastic accuracy for the empirical data, both old and new. The core difference between the two theories is that in the earlier classical theory, all causal effects in the world of matter are reducible to the action of matter upon matter, whereas in the new theory, our conscious intentions and mental efforts play an essential and irreducible causal role in the determination of evolving material properties of the physically described world, i.e., mental activity actually affects physical occurrences that are detected, or at least on the quantum level. But the quantum level, quantum stuff happens everywhere. So even though the micro might seem like it's a small scale of things, it's really important. So these ramifications need to be fully dealt with. The ramifications of this need to be fully dealt with. Thus, the new theory elevates our acts of conscious observation from causally impotent witnesses of flow of physical events determined by material processes alone to irreducible mental inputs, to the determination of the future of an evolving psychophysical universe. In this orthodox quantum mechanical understanding of the world, our minds matter. Orthodox quantum mechanical understanding. This is mainstream quantum physics, orthodox quantum mechanical understanding. So it came from a situation where conscious observation and mental element is impotent to one where the flow of physical events is affected by irreducible mental inputs in determination of future of evolving psychophysical universe. The universe itself being psychophysical. And it might remind you of mentalism, and that's not a coincidence. Mentalism basically being the principle of mind over matter, or at least what's implied here is of mind and matter being fundamentally linked in the functioning of the universe. An adequate basic scientific theory of reality must explain all of the regularities of human experience. That totality includes not only data pertaining to the motions of planets and terrestrial objects and the evidence from atomic physics, but also evidence concerning the observed effects in our everyday lives of our conscious intentional efforts upon subsequent bodily behavior. These ubiquitous facts of everyday life exhibit a strong positive correlation between one's conscious intention to produce a desired bodily intention, such as the raising one's arm or moving one's finger, and a follow-up bodily motion of the intended kind. Thus, my mental effort to raise my arm is normally quickly followed. If I focus my intention upon it by the rising of my arm, an appreciation of this correlation between subjective mental intent and subsequent physically described reality is far more important to the normal living of one's life than the periodic motions of some some tiny pinpoints of the light in the night sky. What matters most to us is what we are able to do about our physical future and how we're able to do it. In this connection, the everyday experience-based belief in the causal power of the person's mental effort to influence the subsequent physically described reality is rationally buttressed by the fact that contemporary, i.e. quantum, science supports that intuition, rather than diminishing us by claiming, as did classical physics, that the experienced causal effectiveness in the physical world of our mental intentions is the illusion of conscious will. A personal belief in the power of one's mental intentions to affect one's physical future is the rational foundation of our lives. Our cognizance of this causal effectiveness of our own thoughts underlies our rational effortful engagement with the world, and consequently also the structures of our social institutions, of our moral imperatives, of our legal systems, of our notions of justice, and of conscious efforts to improve the lives of ourselves and those we care about. Well, fuck, right? I mean, that's huge. And heuristics, by heuristics, we have a basic understanding of this. By intuition, by day-to-day life, we have a basic understanding of this. And what this tells us, the actual science tells us, is that this is actually in alignment with quantum physics, mainstream quantum physics, not necessarily mainstream interpretations of it, but if you actually look at orthodox quantum mechanical understanding of things, our minds matter a lot. Even in the most renowned theory of quantum physics, or interpretation of quantum physics, I'll say, which is the Copenhagen interpretation, which is that when you observe, I'm probably butchering the whole concept, but when you observe the particles seemingly going in two paths at once, even though there's only one particle, and arriving two places, even though there's only one of them, in the double slit experiment, when you observe the position of a particle as opposed, and when you observe its motion, that mental choice of observation having a change and the effect, the collapse of the superposition based on conscious choices, this means something significant. Oh, wait, yeah. That is the idea in Copenhagen interpretation, is that it is what we see. That the straightforward, empirically observed, what we empirically observe, just that is what's happening. They don't try to ascribe a theory or an underlying mechanics to it. They just say, we observe a superposition, but it seems to multiple positions, and then it collapses into one. Therefore, that's what's happening. Now, there's weaknesses potentially to that, but there's a sort of elegance in simply going with, well, this is what the facts show. In a raw, scientific, positive sense, the Copenhagen interpretation is pretty strong. And I mean, it has pretty bold implications. Now, that isn't to say that it's definitely the only valid interpretation of quantum physics and that there aren't things to learn from other interpretations of quantum physics. There are actually things to learn about, for example, Bohmian mechanics or even multiple universe theory. But this was probably something he's going to go into in more depth. Anyway, I'll continue. In a causally mindless mechanical world of the kind entailed by the materialist precepts of classical physics, this power of our minds is denied, and that denial eliminates any possibility of a rationally coherent conception of the meaningfulness of one's life, which I would say leads towards nihilism. Physicalism leads towards nihilism, honestly, because there's no any mental elements, including ethics and meaning and purpose in life, all these things, they're based on mental elements having significance beyond being mere manifestations of the physical. Without that, they're just kind of meaningless, and it kind of even takes free will out the window. Like, it renders it all meaningless and pointless. And like, if there's no life after death, well, I mean, that's not something the big deal, really. It's more that there's no, it renders morality and ethics are just kind of meaningless without, in the face of physicalism. And we can see the effects in society now, but I'm not going to pontificate too much on that, and it's not really what he's saying here. For how can your life be meaningful if you are naught but a mechanical puppet, every action of which was completely fixed by a purely mechanical process, by predetermined already at the birth of the universe? I mean, hard determinism is a pretty depressing thought if you think about it. The inclusion of the quantum element of random chance can rescue the meaningfulness. Oh, we did read it right. Can rescue the meaningfulness of one's life. For these choices are not written in stone or fixed by mechanical determinism. Hence, by being fundamentally indeterminate or random, they can become biased by values, which can thereby influence the course of physical events. If you doubt that values can influence the course of events, look at politics, and immediately you can see that values significantly affect physical events on the planet. Certainly biophysical events, in the sense of like events relating to biological organisms such as humans. I mean, even like interaction between humans and pets, I mean, have physical effects and mental elements to them. The philosophical difficulties ensuing from Newton's presumption about light and the atomic character of matter are eliminated from orthodox quantum physics by the replacement of Newtonian classical dynamics by a quantum dynamics that elevates our minds from passive bystanders to active participants in the creation of our psychophysical future. This radical revision of the role of our minds in the determination of our future arises directly from the elimination from the material world of all particles of the kind imagined to exist by Isaac Newton, and their replacement by the quantum idea of atomic particles. These latter entities are mathematically described elements of a new kind that are intrinsically tied to all conscious experiences. Replacing the purely fictional Newtonian particles by the experience-related atoms of quantum physics converts the classically conceived world that has no rational place for causally efficacious conscious experiences into a quantum world of potentialities for certain experiences to occur, i.e. the superposition. It converts a known to be empirically false materialist conception of the world into a rationally coherent quantum conception of reality in which our causally efficacious minds play an essential role in the determination of our common psychophysical future. Efficacious is the word, not efficacious. According to this quantum mechanical understanding of reality, the very same laws that were originally introduced to account for the empirical findings in the domain of atomic physics explain also how a person's mental intentions can affect that person's bodily actions in the way that he or she mentally intends. The advance from 17th century materialist science to 21st century probabilistic quantum physics thus converts our minds from slaves of our brains to causal partners with our brains. What is this us that's not the physical part of us? That is this mental us that's partners with our brain, right? The brain side of us, what is the partner to that? No, you have to take the physical interactions and put it on one category, and then consider it like connected fundamentally to another category, which would be mental. Now, what is that mental that is beyond physical? We could just simply say energy. I mean, that's not exactly false, but why is that energy mental? What is this mental energy? Well, even Carl Jung would say that would be psychic energy in some sense. There has been research into psi, right? PSI, and psychic abilities and things like that. Now, there's a lot of skepticism about that, but fundamentally, there has to be some sort of element, and I don't mean literal element, but like, what is this energy? Well, there is, what is this quantum field? What is this quantum mental energy? If everything is quantum and mental activity has a fundamental quantum element to it, what if everything has a fundamental conscious element to it, rooted in quantum physics, or which quantum physics explores or taps into? Prana seems to be what it is, or perhaps the energy of your chakras, right? All right, well, that's my view. A general recognition of this profound transformation of science's image of man from mechanical automaton to free from material coercion, agent constitutes a contribution of science to today's troubled world that could in the end be far more important than its engineering offerings. For how we use our scientific knowledge depends on our values, and our values depend on our self-image. The aim of this book is to convey to the general readers in simple but accurate terms how realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics works, with emphasis on the impact of this science-based understanding of ourselves on the meaningfulness of our lives. And something sprang to mind there is there's this focus on, by elites at the moment, on bringing engineering feats, computing feats into the mind, introducing, essentially making us cyborgs, right? That is seems to be the main focus. The idea of fundamentally rooted in a more Newtonian style, I'll say loosely Newtonian, the idea of mechanical determinism seemingly, and it's making us more mechanical in nature, but quantum physics flies in the face of that as it stands. So perhaps the message of a book like this is actually quite important. Chapter 1, The Origins of the Quantum Conception of Man. Every culture has its law about the origins and nature of the world and its people. Those ideas are often associated with a deity or deities. and an associated religion. But there arose in the Western civilization in the 17th century a connection between the ideas of Galileo Galilei and Sir Francis Bacon, the notion of a scientific approach to our understanding of the nature of things. Galileo emphasized the importance of doing experiments specifically designed to shed light on particular questions. Thus, in order to gain knowledge about how gravity works, he measured the acceleration of falling objects of varying weights by dropping them from high places, or by allowing them to roll slowly down inclined planes. Sir Francis Bacon, on the other hand, emphasized that a detailed understanding of the workings of nature would allow us to put nature to work for us, to make her a potent ally in the pursuit of human well-being. Thus, whereas our basic beliefs about the nature of things had generally been based on ancient traditions and sacred writings that ratified prayers and active worships as the prescribed means of getting nature to help us, the new scientific idea was to gain an understanding of the regularities of nature by means of experimental observations in order to put her thus discovered orderliness to work for us. This seismic shift from religious dogma to empirical evidence was the basis of the science that followed. Isaac Newton used it to develop what has become known as classical mechanics, which prevailed as the fundamental scientific theory about the nature of things until the beginning of the 20th century. But at that point, it became clear that nature did not conform to the simple precepts postulated by Isaac Newton. A new scientific theory was needed and was duly created. I will add that the simple scientific idea of Isaac Newton isn't accurate in the sense that he was actually into the occult and to astrology, like even more so than science, actually. He was even, from what I hear, interested in hermetics, but he didn't, that was on the down low. He wasn't like talking about all that so much because we've been considered heretical, right? Despite it was being the Enlightenment, there were certain things that wouldn't have been considered kosher or whatever. Oh, it's not time to change page yet. The seismic shift from religious dogma to empirical evidence was the basis of the science that followed. Isaac Newton used it to develop what has been known as classical mechanics, which prevailed as a fundamental scientific theory about the nature of things until the beginning of the 20th century. But at that point, it became clear that nature didn't conform to it. A new theory was needed. Over the course of the first half of the 20th century, scientists constructed relativistic quantum field theory, RQFT, which is a hugely successful rational approach that yields validated predictions of high accuracy. The core difference between the newer theory and the older one is that quantum theory is primarily about, and is built directly upon, the empirical structure of our conscious experiences, whereas the classical theory was built on a postulated dynamics of material properties, with the everyday apparent dependence of material properties on our conscious intentions reduced to an asserted dependence upon material properties alone, i.e. that the mental element is simply reduced to material properties of the brain. Thus, standard quantum mechanics involves, in an essential way, the causal participation of the minds of us observers, while classical mechanics strictly bans any such effect on mental realities on the world of matter. I shall begin this narrative with the brief sketch of the more familiar classical physical theory, which is taught in our schools and some of our colleges without adequate emphasis on its profound differences with its contemporary quantum successor with respect to the with respect to the causal role of our minds. the classical predecessor to contemporary physics. The science-based approach to understanding nature began in earnest with the work of Isaac Newton, who said, it seems probable to me that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, moving particles. But the core message of he didn't say that. He just said that. Yeah, but the core message of quantum mechanics is that the solid particle conception of matter is a figment of Newton's imagination. A pure fiction understood in orthodox, completely unlike the stuff that constituted the constituents of the material world as it is understood in orthodox quantum mechanics. In that newer theory, the mathematically described world in which we find ourselves embedded has the nature of a set of potentialities for the occurrence of certain kinds of perceptions. And these potentialities behave in many ways more like mental realities than like solid material particles that Newton described. Moreover, those Newtonian particles were presumed to interact with one another primarily by contact. Yet, according to Newton, they also attract each other by the force of gravity, which acts instantaneously over astronomical distances. This is something known as spooky action at a distance, or non-local interaction, or quantum entanglement. When accused of mysticism because of this assumed instantaneous action at a distance, Newton replied that one body can act upon another at a distance through a vacuum without the mediation of anything else is to me a great absurdity that I believe no man has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. Newton obviously rejected as nonsense the idea of an immaterial, instantaneous action at a distance. Yet he offered no hypothesis about how the information concerning the location of a source of gravity could be instantaneously conveyed to a far-away system. He justified his mysterious assumption by the fact that it led to an understanding of many known astronomical and terrestrial empirical findings, such as the orbits of planets, the rising of tides, and the falling of apples. Nothing goes faster than light. More than 2 centuries later, Albert Einstein proposed an explanation that made gravity's influence non-instantaneous and indeed transmitted at the speed of light. Einstein's theory demanded, moreover, that no influence of any kind could transfer information faster than the speed of light. This condition became a bedrock principle of physics that was genuinely accepted by scientists. But the challenge of maintaining it in the face of 20th century empirical findings, or dealing adequately with its failure, has become the most basic task of science of our era. The entire scientific worldview rests upon the completion of this task, which is entangled with our science-based understanding of our own human nature. So the scientific community is desperately and continues to desperately seek a theory of everything which explains things without abandoning physicalism. That's how I understand it. Like, they're basically Newton and Einstein, and you could even say broadly speaking, the Enlightenment, so to speak, established this idea that mental elements have no effect on things. And despite almost 100 years of quantum physics, the scientific community seems focused on trying to find a way for it to not be physicalism in the end, despite the strength of our evidence in quantum physics of the mental element of things. I don't know about you, but it sounds a lot like the Neoplatonic idea of the idea that everything in the solar system revolved on the Earth. And in order to make sense of the movements they were detecting across the sky, they were like explaining the movement of these different planets and the sun even in these sort of epicycles going around in weird circles and then back again in weird circles. It was it was Copernicus who actually showed that to be false. And what we are seeing here, I think, is there's a resistance to accepting what is clear because of the paradigm and ideological bias, essentially. Philosophical bias, you could say. I would say the cabal does have something to do with this. They are influencing things and making sure there's gatekeeping, because let's be clear, the implications of quantum physics do actually pose a challenge to a lot of the established narratives, because of it indicates the relevancy of mysticism. And they don't want people to believe in mysticism. They want people to believe in either orthodox, established religions, organized religions that they've already controlled over centuries, or be put off by that and go purely physicalist. That's my view anyway. Descartes' dualism. These issues concerning the basic nature of things were brought into focus before Newton was born by the writings of the great French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. He argued that what exists is divided into two different kinds of things: things that occupy locations in three-dimensional space at instants of time, and entities that think. This Cartesian duality set the stage for the developments of science that followed. It allowed the conceived reality to be divided actually into three different kinds of things. Material properties, mental realities, and thinking entities. Material properties are features of things that are built out of particles and their associated energy-carrying fields, and that are fixed by the properties of those component particles and fields. Mental realities include your thoughts, ideas, and feelings. A thinking reality is an entity that is experiencing mental realities. An example of a possible Cartesian material property is the location of a tiny Newtonian-type particle whose center is located at each instant of time at a point in 3D space, with the rest of it lying nearby. Two examples of mental realities are your feeling of pain when you touch a hot stove, and your experience of the color red when looking at a ripe tomato. This is known as a qualia, by the way. An example of a thinking entity is the you that is now experiencing the reading of this book. It thinks your thoughts, knows your ideas, and feels your feelings. It is the I of Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am." Descartes recognized that the mental events occurring in a person's stream of consciousness, the mental events occurring in a person's stream of conscious experiences are associated with the material processes occurring in that person's brain. But he maintained that these mental realities are fundamentally different in kind from the corresponding material activities in the brain. This difference is the famous or infamous Cartesian distinction between mind and body, or mind and brain. Classical determinism. Isaac Newton, building on Descartes' ideas, focused his attention on the material aspects. He formulated material laws of motion that account in detailed way for the motions of the planets in the solar system, for the orbit of the moon around the Earth, for rising tides and falling apples. And his headache after it fell on his head. No, not that. Right. And for the host of other observed features on the material universe. This account makes no mention of any influence of mental realities upon material properties, and is called classical mechanics or classical physics. By virtue of these laws, applied universally to all material things, living or dead, a classical Newtonian type universe is deterministic. This means that the entire history of that universe is fixed for all time, once the initial conditions and the mathematical laws of motion are specified. The aspects of the material universe that are not fixed by the general laws are thus limited to the selection of the initial conditions and the choice of the assumed time invariant laws of motion. specifying these two inputs that determines every material event that will ever occur. No matter-based feature is left to chance, or to the will of either man or nature. This early science-based way of trying to understand reality in terms of matter alone, with no essential input from the mental realm, is called materialism, or sometimes physicalism. So yeah, it doesn't really leave much room for free will. Now, there is the opportunity for something called, I mean, there are some who go with compatibilism, but that's like trying to fit around peg in a square hole. Oh, the other way around. Doesn't work, in my opinion. Philosophical torment. Philosophers have been tormented for centuries by the seeming verdict of science that reduces human beings to mechanical automata. Our rational thoughts and moral sentiments were rendered incapable of deflecting in any way our bodily actions from the path ordained at the birth of the universe. By the purely machine-like material aspects of nature. That conception of reality destroys the rational foundations of moral philosophy. How can you be responsible for your actions if they were completely determined before you were born, and indeed, at the birth of the universe? Also, I mentioned that if you consider pretty much everyone, or most people, they don't really believe, despite the prevailing narrative, they don't really believe in physicalism in relation to, or at least they don't believe in that ramification. They do believe in morals and ethical values and stuff. And they believe in it, despite many of them being atheists. So despite maybe what they even believe, in terms of the day-to-day action, they don't really act consistently with that belief, because to do that would be kind of to be a nihilist who believes in no values and thinks everything is predetermined completely. And that means whatever you do, you could be like, well, I was always going to do it. And in fact, I was always going to say this, and you're always going to complain. And it just meaningless, right? And whatever choice you make, you were going to make that choice, and it's not really a choice, according to that thinking. And we can't, I suspect, on a fundamental subjective level, in experience, living our lives, we can't really operate on the basis of that belief. So a contradiction is maintained, where people might believe in physicalism or atheism, and they'll just like ignore that aspect of the ramifications, because it's just, and leaving it as a contradiction is easier. Anyway, this torment is not confined to moral philosophers. The great 19th century physicist John Tyndall touched upon it when he wrote, "We can trace the development of a nervous system and correlate it with the parallel phenomena of sensation and thought. We see with undoubting certainty they go hand in hand, but we try to soar in a vacuum the moment we seek to comprehend the connection between them." That's Belfast Address, the Belfast Address, 1874. The core difficulty here is that the mental realities, which certainly do exist and have no rational place within the framework of 17th to 19th century science. They are logically disconnected appendages that are added on ad hoc simply because we know that they exist. But their effects on what happens in the material world are, according to classical mechanics, the same as if they do not exist. The reason we seem to be soaring in a vacuum, as Tyndall bemoans, comes from the materialistic viewpoint of classical mechanics. That way of thinking, in order to be complete, must permit the existence of the thoughts we actually experience. God forbid, right? yet it provides absolutely no logical foundation or even tiny toehold for the rational understanding of how human consciousness or feelings can arise from the logical foundation provided by the materialistic precepts of classical mechanics. The Copenhagen shift to a pragmatic stance. During the first quarter of the 20th century, a series of experiments were performed that probed the properties of matter at the level of its atomic constituents. The results were incompatible not merely with the fine details of classical mechanics, but with its basic tenets as well. Responding to this catastrophic breakdown of classical mechanics, scientists created, during the first half of the 20th century, a new theory called quantum mechanics. It is based on concepts profoundly different from those of classical physics, yet yields extremely accurate predictions about the outcomes of reliably replicatable experiments, both old and new. It leads also to a revised understanding of our own human nature that is radically different from the effectively mindless mechanical conceptions entailed by materialistic principles of classical mechanics. The original version of quantum mechanics is called the quantum interpretation because it was hammered out in intense. Sorry, I actually made another mistake. I keep on misspeaking here. I don't know why. So, the original version of quantum mechanics is called the Copenhagen interpretation because it was hammered out in intense discussions centered at Niels Bohr's institute in that city. Niels Bohr's institute in that city. In order to dodge various philosophical difficulties, quantum theory was originally offered not as a theory of reality, but rather as a pragmatic set of rules. These rules were designed to allow physicists to make reliable statistical predictions about what observers would experience in response to their various contemplated, alternative, possible probing actions of observation or measurement. So it's basically a theory that pretends not to be a theory, right? Probably because of the paradigm. And the problem is, the Copenhagen interpretation is still mainstream, the mainstream one. There are others, but essentially it means ever since, even though it's almost 100 years, this seems that the majority, the mainstream take has been pragmatically and conveniently ignoring the full ramifications by just treating it as a pragmatic set of rules. I wonder why that was done. I wonder if they were pressured into that. Virtues of realism. But the new theory can also be interpreted realistically or ontologically as an understanding of reality itself. A realistic interpretation is, in fact, needed if one seeks to extract from science any deep insight into the nature of the universe and of our human selves within it. You might think that that's the whole purpose of science, but yeah. The thesis expounded in this book is that von Neumann's orthodox formulation of quantum mechanics, elucidated where needed by the ideas of Heisenberg, Dirac, Wheeler, and the mathematician, logician, and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, and updated to the relativistic form developed by Tomonaga and Schwinger, can be regarded as a theory of reality that is sufficiently detailed and accurate to deal with the issues of the general nature of our mental aspects and of the causal connection of our conscious minds to the material world in which our brains and bodies are embedded. Now, you can go back to take it in clearer if you want, because like, That's powerful, if you ask me. Now, I imagine that's the main premise which the rest of the book will be exploring. So, wow, this is the beginning of the 6th page and all this time. So, a condition on the scope of a science-based theory of reality. An adequate scientific theory of reality ought to accommodate all the regularities of human experience. This includes not only the results of experiments pertaining to astronomical, terrestrial, and atomic physics, but also to the experiences of normal everyday life. These ubiquitous subjective data reveal a strong positive correlation between a person's felt mental intention to perform a simple bodily action, such as raising an arm or finger, and a subsequent perception of the intended bodily action. Empirical data of this kind constitute the rational foundation of our active, meaningful lives. They effectively instruct us how, by making appropriate mental efforts, to influence our bodily actions in mentally intended ways. A theory of reality that fails to provide a rationally coherent account, not only of astronomical, terrestrial, and atomic data, but also this directly experienced mind-body relationship, is fundamentally deficient. Such deficient theories include materialistic classical mechanics, which claims that everything real is created by the interaction of matter with itself, but then fails to explain how these purely material processes generate our conscious perceptions and how our causally efficacious mental efforts. Similarly inadequate is any non-standard materialistic version of quantum theory that does not account for our subjective experiences and the capacity of mental effort to influence in desired ways the behavior of our bodies. I mean, as he established, that's pretty solid evidence anyway. So if it doesn't account for that, it fails to account for pretty basic fundamental things. The standard orthodox quantum mechanics can, by virtue of its mathematical structure and the words used to describe it, be naturally interpreted realistically. And when thus interpreted, it brings our mental aspects into the dynamics, such as experimental realities that are causally linked to matter via specified laws of nature. I call this interpretation realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics. It evades the logically impossible task of explaining how felt mental properties can be constructed out of mechanical material properties alone, by postulating the elemental existence of both mind and matter, and then describing in rational mathematical terms how they interact with each other. And it's all science. Von Neumann's orthodox formulation of quantum mechanics. The standard quantum theory, against which all others are compared, is von Neumann's orthodox formulation of Copenhagen quantum mechanics, or more specifically, the updated version called relativistic quantum field theory, abbreviated as RQFT. It is this relativistic orthodox version of quantum theory that is propounded in this book. As will be presently explained, this theory is about both, one, the dynamical interaction of matter with itself that accounts for the unobserved behavior of mental substances, and two, the interaction between mind and matter that constitutes the highly non-trivial process of observation. In quantum mechanics, the mind-matter interaction is mathematically very different from the matter-matter interaction. And it is different in a mathematical way that entails that the former can never be reduced to the latter. The difference in these two dynamical processes is directly connected to the Heisenberg's seminal 1925 discovery, which quickly led to the creation of quantum mechanics. This new theory gives detailed explanations of the plethora of 20th century data of atomic physics that has resisted all attempted explanations via the materialist precepts of classical physics. Heisenberg's discovery was that the process of observation, whereby the observer comes to consciously know the numerical value of a material property of an observed system, cannot be understood within the framework of materialist classical mechanics. A non-classical process is needed. This process does not construct mind out of matter, nor reduce mind to matter. Instead, it explains in mathematical terms how a person's immaterial conscious mind interacts with that person's material brain. Now, that last bit I'll repeat. Instead, it explains in mathematical terms how a person's immaterial conscious mind interacts with that person's material brain. And it's based on it's based on quantum physics as it stands. It just takes it literally, essentially. It takes it as it is rather than a pragmatic rather than just as a pragmatic way to explain it that is not deemed how it is. How is it? A pragmatic set of rules. There you go. It's not how it is. It's just, this is how we need to make sense of it, right? Well, no, there is no need for that. What is the justification given for that? Because the alternative is inconceivable? Is it though? Or is it just outside of the paradigm? You know, given the prevalence of constructivism and the idea of paradigm shifts, you would think that consciousness of that would, that people would be, applied that to quantum physics and physics in general, but it seems not. An immaterial mind lies beyond the ken of a materialistic approach, and the mathematics that describes the process of conscious observation is not reducible to the mathematics that describes the process of the unobserved evolution of matter. The eminent Hungarian-American mathematician and logician John von Neumann cast the ideas of Copenhagen quantum mechanics into a rationally coherent and mathematically rigorous form that is widely used by mathematical physicists and also by others who require mathematical and logical precision. So it works usefully in applied ways to make sense of reality in a way that cannot be explained by materialism. It is only the insistence in the prevailing narrative or paradigm to treat it as a pragmatic set of values that prevents the full ramifications being actually recognized, despite them working around that very precept by actually applying it as if they believe it really is how the universe works. So there's you could almost say hypocritical or double standard there, where they're going, what? They're saying, oh no, it's just pragmatic. But they might as well just abandon materialism, but that's the paradigm, so they don't do that. It's more like a workaround. Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner labeled von Neumann's formulation orthodox quantum mechanics. The label orthodox is appropriate in the sense that many, and perhaps all mathematical physicists, take it to be logical and mathematically precise, the logical and mathematically precise formulation of the Copenhagen ideas. Von Neumann approached these mind-related issues by considering what amounts to a tower of good measuring devices where each device associates one by one each input to a corresponding output, and the output of each device is the input to the device above it. On the top of this tower lies an observer's conscious ego that can both receive perceptual inputs and instigate probing actions by means of its interactions with its associated brain. About the entry of consciousness into the dynamics, von Neumann says, first, it is inherently entirely correct. The measurement or the related process of subjective perception is a new entity relative to the physical environment and is not reducible to the latter. Indeed, subjective perception leads us into the intellectual life of the individual, which is extra-observational by its very nature. This first quote emphasizes that within von Neumann's orthodox representation of quantum mechanics, the process of subjective perception is not reducible to the process that governs the interaction of matter with itself. The subjective conscious perceptions are, as Descartes has declared, neither equivalent to nor reducible to the behavior of matter. I take this as this irreducibility of mind to the behavior of matter to be, on the basis of this quote and everything else said in von Neumann's book, a core feature of realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics. The second quote is, it must be possible to describe the extra-physical process of subjective perception as if it were in reality in the physical world, i.e. by assigning to its parts equivalent real parts in the objective world in ordinary space. I take these equivalent real parts to be primarily the neutral or brain correlates of our conscious perceptions, i.e. what we're feeling and thinking relating to what can be observed in the brain. And what you observe in the brain being a sort of reflection. But I would compare it to like a reflection when you're looking in like water. I don't mean still water, I mean water that's, the surface is very disturbed. So you don't get a clear reflection back, or at least not yet, because you can't reduce what's going on consciously to the brain. But I see it as more like a causal downflow from non-physical mind to physical brain, essentially. The third quote is, now quantum mechanics describes the events which occur in the observed portion of the world, so long as they do not interact with the observing portion with the aid of process 2. But as soon as such an interaction occurs, i.e. a measurement, it requires the application of process 1. I'll say that again since I butchered that. Now quantum mechanics describes the events which occur in the observed portion of the world, so long as they do not interact with the observing portion with the aid of process 2. But as soon as such interaction occurs, i.e. a measurement, it requires the application of process 1. This third quote introduces the two very different processes, process 1 and process 2. Process 2 is the quantum analog of the dynamical process of classical physics. Like its classical counterpart, process 2 involves only the material aspects of nature and is deterministic. It is also unitary, which means essentially that its action merely shuffles information around without losing any of it. This process 2 depends in no way on the mental aspects of nature, but but the material physical state of the universe upon which process 2 acts contains the neural correlates of our perceptions that were introduced in the second quote. Process 1 is a process that generates perceptions. Each process 1 action is associated with a particular conscious observer. It has a mathematical form that is very different from that of process 2. Process 1 is not unitary, but is instead projective. It is associated with the subjective occurrence of a perception coupled to the instantaneous elimination from the material universe of all aspects that are incompatible with the occurrence of that perception. Now that's key, because you perceive something, and then suddenly anything in physical reality that isn't consistent with what you subjectively perceive disappears out of reality. Those parts of reality in the superposition of a whole set of possibilities, when you observe and perceive subjectively those set of simultaneously true possibilities in superposition, which are all simultaneously true until observed, according to this, when observed, according to how it's subjectively perceived, the reality literally changes to match it. And this perception is not brain activity, but non-physical mental activity, determining physical reality. And this is hard scientific evidence, proof in quantum physics, mainstream quantum physics, taking the Copenhagen interpretation as a description of reality rather than just a pragmatic workaround. That's huge. This is huge, absolutely huge, the significance of this. Or at least I think so. I know so. Where was I? Oh. Thus, this process has two phases. The first phase selects a possible next subjective perception on the part of the observer. This possible potential next perception defines a corresponding brain correlate, which has, according to the theory, a certain statistical weight. The second stage of process 1 then reduces the material universe to two parts. One that definitely contains this brain correlate, and the other that definitely does not contain this brain correlate. And it actualizes either one part or the other. This choice made by nature between the two parts accords with a certain statistical rule known as the Born rule. This Born rule choice is the unique place where an element of chance enters into the quantum dynamics. The preceding choice of a possible next perception reflects the history and the felt values of the observer, and it is identified with what the observer feels is his or her personal subjective choice of what the physical property of the observed system to probe or inquire about. The preceding choice of a possible next perception reflects the history and felt values of the observer and is identified with what the observer feels is his or her personal subjective choice of what physical property of the observed system to probe or inquire about. No element of chance is ascribed to this choice made by an observer of a particular possible probing action. No element of chance is ascribed to this choice made by an observer of a particular possible probing action. So, according to this, you can't say there's a certain chance of one of these possibilities happening and it just happens to be like cosmic dice, which one it turned out to be, and this is what it is that happened. Therefore, it was kind of, therefore, it's not free will, it's like chance. And each event, each choice that someone makes is chance. It's not that. It can't be that according to this actual science here. According to the Born rule, it can't be that. The Born rule establishes, in my opinion, that it's a fundamental conscious choice that creates the physical change in reality, the collapse in the superposition, and which it is. Not random, not random. It can't be random because of the Born rule. Doesn't this prove mentalism? Doesn't this prove the law of attraction? Doesn't this prove that non-physical mind determines reality on a physical level? I think so. The two phases of process one are manifestations of the differing points of view on Heisenberg and Dirac, cited by Bohr, in which Heisenberg emphasizes the free choice on the part of the experimenter of which probing experiment to perform, while Dirac emphasized the choice of the part of nature regarding which outcome occurs. But we are nature, right? Right, so they're separating. They're like, okay, there's nature and there's us. And we are not nature, so nature's choosing for us, right? They're saying, okay, the universe is just determining what it is, right? But even then it's deemed to be a choice. So either the universe as a whole is choosing it and not predetermined, choosing it like, or the conscious element is us linked to the universe, i.e. if nature is the same, if nature is source and we are source, we are making that choice, right? And otherwise it's like God, right? But if we understand us as source, either way, it's us consciously as God determining reality, right? But of course, if you're not going with pantheism, could you potentially explain it away as nature determining it? Perhaps, but maybe that'll be explored in more detail. So Heisenberg emphasized the free choice on the part of the experimenter, which the Born rule does seem to establish as definitely having occurring, and not chance. Not occurring by chance and occurring by conscious decision. And Dirac emphasized the choice on the part of nature regarding what outcome occurs. Even if he did emphasize that, though, the Born rule does seem to suggest, or well, outright indicate, that Heisenberg was right in that, right? The whole process resembles, as emphasized by Wheeler, the game of 20 questions, in which a succession of yes-no questions is posed, with each eliciting yes or no response. Von Neumann cast into rigorous mathematical form the key ideas of the founders, insofar as they strayed from the official pragmatic path and tried, as scientists rightfully do, to understand what is really going on. The fact that the generation of a conscious perception involves a dynamical process that is structurally and mathematical, extremely different from the deterministic matter-driven process that governs the unobserved evolution of reality is the basic difference between the materialistic classical mechanics and its quantum successor. The classical theory presumes that all aspects of nature can be explained purely in terms of the action of matter upon matter. But the quantum world differs in a fundamental way from that core precept of materialism. This huge structural difference in the real, i.e. quantum world, between the matter-matter interaction and the matter-mind interaction makes manifest the extreme naivety of trying to comprehend the connection between mind and matter within a materialistic framework. I like the timing of that firework. Anyway, in the quantum world, the observing process of acquiring empirical knowledge must disturb, or perhaps even bring into existence, the values that we observe. By virtue of Heisenberg's discovery, the process of our acquiring knowledge about the material aspects of nature cannot merely reveal already existing values. The process of our acquiring knowledge injects our mental aspects in an essential way into the process that determines what we will find if we look. So we learn new things which affects how we change reality with our minds. This non-materialistic action injects into the mind of the observer as a causal agent into realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics. It gives our minds an essential dynamical role to play, and hence a natural and rational reason for them to exist. In this game of 20 questions, the yes answer is the occurrence some particular perception, say P. So the question must, in principle, be whether the upcoming experience will be P. The question is thus a non-verbalized inquiry of the form, will my upcoming perception be P? Where P is a felt experience representation of a particular possible next perception. This query is instantly followed by nature's response, yes or no. This two-phased process allows our human conscious choices to enter causally into the evolution of the matter-based aspects of the world, rather than being helpless witnesses of a flow of events completely determined by the material aspects of nature alone. It also, in my opinion, fundamentally shows how our cognitive process, our psyche and decisions we make on that level, and let's say nature, what nature determines, is fundamentally linked. So the idea that we are nature, our non-physical mind is nature, that nature is a non-physical mind, and that we are all that non-physical mind that is everywhere. That might sound a bit like panpsychism or pantheism, because it pretty much is. Our probing actions and their observed outcomes are described in terms of potential and actual perceptions, respectively. According to the orthodox theory, these perceptions are described in the language, conceptual structure, of classical physics. In orthodox quantum theory, these disparate perceptual and associated material properties are causally tied together by the quantum dynamical laws that govern their mutual interaction. Mind is dynamically tied to matter, but it is neither made of matter nor dynamically predetermined by matter. I'm just wondering if, you could apply quantum physics to explaining hermetic laws. I'm pretty sure this is already proven the law of mentalism. In summary, the orthodox quantum understanding of the evolving world rests upon a specified quantum process of evolution of a psychophysical universe. This process consists of two very different sub-processes. Von Neumann calls them process 1 and process 2. Process 2 is a quantum analog of the classical process of evolution of material systems. It produces evolution in accordance with the famous Schrödinger equation. This process 2 by itself generates a completely specified and predetermined continuous temporal morphing of the material properties of the universe into a continuous quantum smear of classically describable possibilities or potentialities. Like its classical counterpart, this process depends in no way on any mental aspect of nature. This process 2 is a matter-generated evolution. This process 2, matter-generated evolution, generates, however, not just one single world of the kind that we actually perceive, but rather a continuum of possible perceivable worlds. Consequently, some other process is logically required in order to extract from this process 2 generation of a continuum of potentialities a choice of what actually happens in the material world, besides this process 2 generation of ever-growing sets of perceptual possibilities. This other process is called process 1. This numbering, which might seem odd, reflects the fact that the first action had to choose and actualize some particular state of reality, not just shuffle around information that was already present. What this makes me think, or I don't like using the word think these days, but an idea this gave me was, what if process 1 is source, and what if process 2 is the hologram, right? Put it another way, what if process 1 is the conscious aspect of reality? You could say God, you could say the aspect of reality, that the mental conscious energy that determines everything in the universe, essentially, right? Or at least chooses or manifests, or which possibility plays out, right? And the other one is process 2. Process 2, now each potentiality that process 2 related to process 2. So process 2, it all works out according to the Schrödinger equation in a predetermined way. But which predetermined way it happens is chosen according to process 1, a process which is fundamentally conscious, involving nature and essentially the soul, or the consciousness of, you could say, a person, let's say, and the universe as one choosing it. And process 2 is the playing out of what's chosen. Now, and the reason why it works out is that it's not that process 1 is doing all the intricacies of what happens. That's determined by the Schrödinger equation. It's more a choice. So the universe functions as it has software, right? Think of it like process 2 is software that follows the commands of process 1. Like the programmer is process 1. What happens on the program is process 2. Process 2 is the program, the hologram. The universe, in that sense, physical universe, that is the playing out of what's chosen. You don't do all the, in a computer, right? You don't do every single little detail of what happens, all the binary choices and all of that. You don't do all of that. You make a choice, and the nitty gritty is done by programs that are already encoded in. It's that these programs are programs about how reality works, pre-coded in by God or by source, which we are. And source is trying to experience, is experiencing getting to know itself, and it's going into incarnation and stuff to do that. And we are part of source, and that's also what we're doing as well. And that seems to be, to me, fundamentally what Heisenberg, I think this is Heisenberg, Heisenberg's process A and B, no, processes 1 and 2 is. I mean, it fits to me. I mean, I've definitely, I've got a bias, I suppose, but it's pretty solid, isn't it? I mean, if you're trying to make, if someone were trying to make a case based on science, you would refer to evidence in a manner like this, right? So, yeah. Wait, where was I? Other personal conscious thoughts enter the quantum dynamics via these abrupt process 1 actions. Our human minds instigate probing actions upon the quantum atomic particle-based material world that is evolving in accordance with process 2. Each such process 1 intervention is, in line with the ideas of Heisenberg, Dirac, Wheeler, and Whitehead, resolved by a 2-phased action. The first phase is a probing action, which poses a yes-no query about an observer's upcoming perceptual experience. The choices of these probing actions are, according to the precepts of quantum mechanics, not fully determined by the prior material properties of the atom-based world. They originate in the association with the observer's mind, which von Neumann calls the observer's ego. I would say it's by the observer's soul. I would say that the ego has a role in it as well, but something what I would say, according to A Course in Miracles, and specifically more directly what Aaron Abke is saying in his course that I'm doing, the ego is kind of an illusion created by the soul on some level. It's a sort of illusion and a sort of confusion, and it causes suffering. It's necessary for survival under the veil of ignorance in third density or 3D, but when we're ascending to the next level at this point, it's not necessary anymore. We don't need to learn the lessons of third density anymore, so we don't need it. What we need, what's more useful now, pardon me, and also with the society, or more advanced technology and stuff, our survival isn't really under threat so much. And this whole idea of, well, I need to increase or decrease my social positions over hierarchy, but the ego is basically serving that function. Well, our success in life is probably better guided by being more conscious, being consciously doing it, with a limited ego presence or role and more presence, higher frequency, and doing it on a soul level consciously. So anyway, back to this. These choices are free in the very sense that they are not determined by the prior quantum mechanical state of the universe. They are therefore called free choices. This injection of an element of freedom from material coercion constitutes, this is like just the material making us do a certain thing. It's not coercion in the other sense. From material coercion constitutes a major departure of quantum mechanics from classical mechanics and from the general philosophical stance of materialism, or physicalism, I would add, which demands that the evolution of matter to be fully determined by physical properties alone. The second phase of process one is an immediate yes-no response on the part of what British physicist Paul Dirac, the key founder of quantum mechanics, called nature. A positive yes response adds the perception P, which was specified by the observer's query, to the observer's stream of consciousness, perceptual experiences. I would add that the brain activity corresponding to a choice or an experience is noticed. No, that's not it. We are aware on an egoic level of a choice we made after it's occurred in the brain. So I'm not sure if that's as relevant as I thought it was. Anyway, where was I? A positive yes response adds the perception P, which is specified by the observer's query, to the observer's stream of conscious perceptual experiences. It also entertainously reduces, i.e. collapses, the global quantum state of the universe to the part of its immediately prior form that is compatible with that positive response, i.e. there's a whole set of possibilities. Let's say there's 10 of them, but there's a whole bunch more than that. There's a whole set of possibilities of what will be, right? And based on a yes-no response, one of these is determined as to be which it will be. The rest collapses out of what is experienced. Only one of them is experienced in reality. The rest don't play out. A choice is made, and that determines what happens in physical reality. A negative response leaves the observer's stream of consciousness unaffected. No perception occurs, but it reduces the global quantum state of the universe to a form compatible with that negative response. Nature responds sequentially to the probing yes-no questions posed by the various observers. But how is the needed connection established between a person's mental choices or probing actions and the intended bodily response? It can be assumed that the observer's ego creates, by trial and error learning, beginning in the womb, a mapping of the perceived response to each of various mentally instigated probing actions. Thus, the ego's knowledge of which effort tends to lead to which perceptual feedback can be learned. It need not be innate. In mathematical terms, the quantum mechanical state of the universe, P, is first reduced by the observer's probing action to a sum of two terms. Okay, now this P, okay. In mathematical terms, the quantum mechanical state of the universe, which is it's like a Greek P. I don't know what symbol that is. I'll just say psi for that. I know that's not accurate, but okay. Psi is the first reduced by the observer's probing action to a sum of two terms, P psi P, and P apostrophe psi P apostrophe. Where this P is a projection operator, brackets, P times P equals P, and P apostrophe is 1 minus P, nature actualizes one or the other term in statistical concordance with the Born rule, which asserts that the probability of state P psi P will be actualized is trace P psi P divided by trace psi, where for any operator or matrix M, trace M means the sum of the diagonal elements of any matrix representation of M. Wow. Yeah, I have to say I don't know the maths or the physics for that bit. So, and even saying psi for that symbol isn't accurate. It's like looks like a Greek P. I don't even know what. It's something in the Greek alphabet. I don't know which. Yeah, I kind of butchered that, but I hope you got something from that paragraph there. I've included in this parenthetical mathematical remark merely to assure readers that the ordinary words that I've been using are not mere verbal fluff. They have definite mathematical meanings, which lead to predictions that are accurate in one highly non-trivial case, to the width of a human hair, compared to the distance of the moon, and that encompass in general a vast realm of pertinent empirical phenomena. Quantum theory thus warrants serious consideration by any reader truly interested in the basic nature of things. Any adequate proposed alternative to the orthodox interpretation needs to produce a theory of the mind-brain connection that is as good or better than the orthodox theory described here. For our experiences are the only things we know, and hence the empirical structure needs to be explained by any basic physical theory that can be deemed satisfactory. Now, I'm definitely open and interested in non-mainstream theories of understandings of quantum physics, especially ones that to me suggest or outright prove or have evidence for essentially non-physicalism or pantheism or what have you, right? But I have to admit, like, even in the Copenhagen interpretation, if you take it as a description of reality, which you typically do with evidence presented to you, as opposed to refusing to do that and instead just taking it as a pragmatic set of rules, then it basically proves pantheism. That's my interpretation anyway. I mean, I'm sure some people might hear this and not be convinced on that. And that's fine, that's fine. But yeah, I could go on. And I mean, I only did like almost 11 pages there, but I've been going on for a while. And I can always do another episode. So if this is page 11, take me about 13 episodes to finish. I don't know. I think maybe I'll carry on a bit longer. So, all right. The next stage, the next chapter here, or not chapter, the next section is the action of mind on matter. This will be interesting. The entry of the abrupt process 1 actions into the continuous process 2 evolution entails that the mind of an observer is no longer a helpless witness to a mechanically predetermined course of material events. The process 1 actions convert the observer's ego into an actor on the world stage. Each probing action initiated by an ego influences, by means of nature's response to that action, the macroscopic behavior of the atomic particle-based material universe. Thus, our minds become endowed, by means of quantum mechanical dynamical rules, with the power to influence the macroscopic properties of matter, without themselves being totally predetermined by material properties alone. This empowerment of our psychological aspects is a fundamental feature of the standard quantum mechanics. I mean, yeah, this change is the basic ontological structure. This change in the basic ontological structure eliminates, by means of an advance in science, the absurdity of a consciousness that can do nothing but delude us into believing an outright lie, that our minds are causally inert, which, if believed, would surely be detrimental to the ambitions of anyone who accepts as veridical the findings of science. For an acceptance of that belief is in total physical impotence of one's conscious efforts. For an acceptance of the total physical impotence, sorry, I'm saying that wrong. For an acceptance of the belief in the total physical impotence of one's conscious efforts would seriously undermine the mental resolve needed to overcome the obstacles that often stand in the way of our efforts to create what we judge to be a better world. I mean, if you want a better world, worth considering, right? The empowering message of quantum mechanics is that empirical data of everyday life and also our intuitions are generally veridical, which means, I mean, they can be verified. I'm not sure about that. Veridical, not delusional, and hence that our mental resolves can often help bring causally to pass the bodily actions that we mentally intend. The role of our minds is to help us, not to deceive us, as the materialist philosophy must effectively maintain. Appearances are deceiving. Classical appearances versus quantum realities. According to quantum rules described above, each true perception is an experience of certain macroscopic features of a material, i.e. atomic particle-based universe. But a basic precept of quantum mechanics asserts that our perceptions are described in the language of classical physics. This means that according to quantum theory, each perception P is described in terms of macroscopic properties of systems built basically out of solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, moving particles of Isaac Newton. That world of perceivable macroscopic properties can be called the world of appearances. On the other hand, quantum mechanics also describes the macroscopic properties of macroscopic systems built out of the atomic particles of atomic physics. From the point of view of realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics, the underlying physical described reality is a quantum state, the so-called density matrix of the universe. Density matrix, huh? Reminds you of the law of one, just saying. And is built out of the quantum mechanically represented atomic particles and their associated quantum fields, whereby the appearances, brackets perceptions, are built out of Newtonian particles. Now, something to keep in mind about perceptions and appearances is, if you've seen the episode I did very recently about actually a reading of Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics by Bernardo Kastrup, what it establishes there is that, well, he had this idea of will and representation. The will is conscious will and representation is kind of like illusion. Essentially, that he thought that it's kind of like mind over matter, really, or at least if you interpret it the way Bernardo Kastrup does. Classically, typically Schopenhauer isn't interpreted that way, but yeah, it's essentially like mind over matter, right? So, or at least that will over representation, that perception, that just mere perception is the representation of things, but that the true reality is conscious will, right? And that conscious will is the divine, right? So I guess source. And it's interesting here that it says where the appearances, perceptions are built out of Newtonian particles. So the representation part, the part that's a hologram, is built out of particles. And it's created and determined and manifested according to process one, the mental element of reality, the non-physical mental element of reality. This relates to mind over matter and mentalism and mysticism and the law of one. So there we are. But this means that in quantum mechanics, both the physical reality and appearances are represented mathematically. This mathematical duality provides a foundation for a greater role of mathematical and logical rigor than was possible in the classical physics-based materialistic approach. More mathematical and logical rigor, huh? So that's pretty solid. There, the underlying physical reality is deemed to be built out of the fictional Newtonian particles instead of the contemporary science-based atomic particles, and the appearances are described in psychological terms. Hence, the quantum mechanical approach to the brain to mind-brain problem is structurally and mathematically very different from the classical materialistic approach. And because both our perceptions and the underlying material causal structure are described mathematically, it provides for greater mathematical and logical rigor than classical physics allows. So you could just like do the mathematics, and the mental and the physical in the mathematics can fit in like directly, right? Whereas you need to do all sorts of roundabout explanations about how mental is derived from the physical otherwise in the materialist paradigm, which is, the math is a lot harder. That's what they're saying. Whereas it elegantly fits together if you abandon physicalism. These two physical theories, classical and quantum, are contradictory. Yet orthodox quantum mechanics combines them to produce a rationally coherent understanding of the connection between mind and brain. Also kind of reminds me of, in another episode, I was talking about Schopenhauer and the will and representation thing. No, I was talking about how in physicalism, there's the more positivist explanation of things, or maybe modernist explanation of things, that everything is physicalist, but they don't really accept the subjectivity and tendency for bias, and the tendency for, the mental subjectivity of things. And the other is effectively, you could say, describe it, to oversimplify it, postmodernism. That idea that heavily focuses on the subjectivity of things while denying a deity, that both deny the divine, deny the mental element of things, and they reduce the mental element of things to mere physicality, right? They both do that, yet if you combine them together with an acceptance and integration of the mental element, i.e. process one, what you get is pantheism or mysticism or law of one, or, well, Copenhagen interpretation taken as a description of reality rather than a set of rules. It's not really an or thing, because they're pretty much the same thing. And I don't know, I feel like intuitively it feels like the classical and the quantum being integrated together is either in some sense the same thing, or as that other integration, or analogous to it, without not being a coincidence either. Yet orthodox, this quantum approach constitutes a way of comprehending that connection that is far more reasonable than what is attainable within the materialistic framework, which is fatally flawed by the omission of our causal minds from the theory of the mind-brain connection. It's like Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. The oft-heard claim that quantum mechanics is not relevant to the mind-brain problem because quantum theory is about only tiny things is absolutely contrary to the basic quantum principles. Being big does not tend to make quantum system truly classical. Being big does not tend to make a quantum system truly classical. Quantum mechanics is explicitly designed to cover big systems, but by becoming big, a quantum system does not become classical. Indeed, the fact that quantum mechanics is explicitly designed to cover big things is important to the solution of the mind-brain problem. For the quantum things, for the mechanical dynamics leads to the evolution of the brain by process 2 into a mixture of many different brain states that correspond to many different potential experiences, and hence to the need for the added process 1 that selects for consideration some perceivable small part of the existing mixture, which nature will then promptly either actualize or reject. This proliferation in the brain of representations of many different alternative possible immediate courses of action is assured by the structure of ion channels. Ion channels are large brain molecules, each having a small tube, a channel, through which ions of a particular kind, say calcium ions, can flow single file under specific brain conditions into the interior of a neuron, where they tend to cause that neuron to release, in due course, a vesicle of a neurotransmitter molecules into the gap that separates that neuron from a neighboring neuron. The narrowness of the ion tube ensures that the ion then enters the interior of that neuron, has a large uncertainty, ensures that the ion that enters the interior of that neuron has a large uncertainty in its direction of motion. Hence, each ion channel in the brain is a source of dynamical uncertainty in the process 2 generated evolution of the quantum state of the brain. The resulting macroscopic state of the brain will thus tend to evolve into a quantum mixture of many different classically describable brain states, each with a different perceptual correlate between the mind-dependent process 1 between which the mind-dependent process 1 is free to choose. Thus, the pertinent for us essence of quantum mechanics is a causal dynamical linkage that QM specifies between our conscious thoughts and our atomic particle-based brains. Now, what does mysticism or law of one or whatever, what does that tell us? It tells us, one thing it tells us is that, well, we have energy bodies, we have souls, right? And that whether or not it's mediated through an ego or done directly, like it would be in fourth density, essentially manifestation or creation or determination of what happens in physical reality happens in the brain, in the neural synapse structure and processes that are fundamentally quantum in nature and macro in nature. For neurons are fundamentally, well, neural, right? Their brain, physical brain structure. And this goes up in scale to the point, and if you just look at the physical structure, right? Not even the quantum element of it, you can look up and scale, zoom all the way in, to all the way out, and you can see how it fits into the overall structure of the brain, right? And if this is all quantum from the smallest level, and you can see how it all fits together, you can see a complex system of quantum of dynamics that are determined by process one and play out based on that process one choice according to process two. So, the consciousness chooses, the soul or the consciousness chooses what it will be. Then process two acts it out like a program. And in the brain, this process manifests via the synapses in the brain and goes up all the way up on scale to the brain as a whole, where if you look at these processes happening as a whole, the brain is the way in which the choices can be played out. And it's like the brain is designed, whether it's designed by evolution or conscious means, or both. Let's say, quote, design or the structure of the brain, all the way down from the neural level, all the way up to the macro level of the brain as a whole, is entirely built for process one to determine which process two happens, built into the neurons itself. This is huge, right? So the mind-matter problem absolutely is explainable by the Copenhagen interpretation. The most mainstream interpretation of quantum physics and physics in general. There's no avoiding it, no honest way to avoid it. Not to judge those who might avoid it, because, I mean, it is the paradigm. It's the main paradigm. And it can be very difficult for people, especially who haven't done the inner work to quite an extent, to avoid that kind of the bias of believing in what they're brought up in to believe in. And generally, it's the paradigm people brought up to believe in. And even those who are religious, when they do their science, are conditioned essentially, or trained, or what have you, to do it and view it in effectively a physicalist way. Their physics, that is. So, the quantum mechanically entailed causal effects of our mental intentions upon the material brains is in complete harmony with our normal intuition, which is based on our lifetimes of first-hand empirical evidence. Our minds are promoted by quantum dynamics from the absurd role of impotent witnesses of events that cannot affect to causally effective instigators of impotent witnesses of events they cannot affect to causally effective instigators of intended bodily actions. And much more than that, I would add. Our minds thus have a natural reason to exist, which is to help us to achieve what we value, not to deceive us into believing we are something we are not. The conclusion here, and in what follows, is that the realistically interpreted orthodox quantum conception of reality provides not only dynamical explanations of a well-established ordinary empirical data, but automatically also the foundation of a rationally coherent dynamical understanding of how our conscious minds can affect our material brains, and hence our material bodies, in ways concordant with both our conscious intentions and the empirical data of everyday life. Those ubiquitous first-hand data which seem to confirm the causal power of our mental intentions need not be interpreted as illusions or delusions, as the Newtonian particle-based materialistic physics appears to demand. Likewise, the problem of the seeming incompatibility of free will and determinism is resolved by noting that QM law of evolution incorporates the inputs from our free brackets, not immaterially coerced, close brackets, choices into the causal dynamics. Hence, there is a natural causal evolution and thus no causal gap or incompatibility that needs to be explained. The reader might be encouraged to take von Neumann's formulation of quantum mechanics seriously by considering the words of the distinguished Nobel laureate Hans Bethe, who said, "I have sometimes wondered whether a brain like von Neumann's does not indicate a species superior to that of man." Another expression of the same idea was a joking suggestion that von Neumann was actually an outer space alien who had trained himself perfectly to imitate a human being in every way. Or who knows? Ooh. No, I'm not going to go with that theory. I may believe in reptilians, but I don't believe in that. Right. Potentia. The central theme of the realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics, RIOQM, being expounded in this book is that the quantum state, i.e. density matrix, of the universe is not merely a useful pragmatic tool as proposed in the epistic Copenhagen conception of quantum mechanics, but is also a representation of essential aspects of reality itself. A basic question is then, what is the ontological character of this aspect of reality? The answer, in concordance with the ideas of Heisenberg and others, is that it has the character of a set of Aristotelian potentialities. That is, it is a collection of potentialities or tendencies or proclivities or dispositions or probabilities for each one of a collection of alternative possible actual mental events to occur, each in conjunction with a new updated set of potentialities. This transformation must be actualized by a process. In RIOQM, one such process consists of a two-phase process one probing action of the kind described in orthodox von Neumann quantum mechanics. There might conceivably be other actualization processes in the fullness of nature, but they are neither specified nor taken into consideration in this theory, which is focused on the details of the connection between our causally efficacious conscious minds and our quantum mechanically described brains. Summary. This first chapter has provided a quick overview of realistically interpreted orthodox quantum mechanics. The next 9 chapters weave into the narrative more details of the various key features of the orthodox causal connection of our minds to our brains. Chapter 11 goes a step further, ontologically, by arguing that the detailed behavioral properties of the different parts of the orthodox structure suggest that the mental and material aspects of reality are lodged in an overarching non-local reality that is fundamentally mind-like in character. The mental and material aspects of the quantum dualism tend to emerge upon detailed analysis into an underlying mental monism that includes mathematically described properties conceived to be embedded in a 4D space-time continuum. In the end, it is indeed true that all is one, and that the unity encompasses both our mental and material aspects. That idea that the underlying reality is fundamentally mind-like has been advanced often before on the basis of all sorts of reasons, but that conclusion is often thought to involve going beyond science, and indeed going against science. That conclusion arises from science-based considerations alone. So there we are. This is the first chapter of a book elucidating a theory that objectively proves via the scientific method pantheism and mentalism. and it disproves physicalism. I'm probably sounding a bit too smug. Sorry, sorry. Yeah. Wow. How sorry if I smug through this. I'm really enjoying it. It validates my preconceptions. I mean, it does. Yeah. I'm curious though, would you have rather that I just read all the way through it without adding my views? I wouldn't rather that, but I certainly rather that. I'll try to not misread things, but this is how it goes sometimes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I knew what I was buying to some extent when I looked up the blurb of this book, and I was like, oh, this looks really interesting. I looked up certain. I did actually a little bit of research in quantum physics and Wikipedia of all things, and I found, not just Wikipedia, but I found out about Henry Stapp and his theory, and I was like, wow, okay, this is great, this is fantastic. I want to do a reading on that, so I got the book, and here we are. So, just as a hint for next time I do a reading of this, chapter 2 is waves, particles, and minds. That might give us some evidence of the law of vibration, who knows? So, keep it real and keep it quantum. Bye for now.